There is one particular thing that the clavichord can do that the modern piano, as wonderful as it is, as advanced as it cannot do this one thing that the clavichord can do, and that is make a vibrato. Actually, the official term on the clavichord for this is Bebel. And the reason that this is possible on the clavichord has to do with the difference between the way the clavichord action works and the way that the piano action works. In the piano, you press down on the key, and there's a very complicated mechanism at the end which makes the hammer, after it strikes the string, immediately falls away from the string. But in the case of the clavichord, that hammer, which is actually something called a tangent, it's a little piece of metal, stays in contact with the string. It doesn't fall away. And so if you keep your finger on the key and you move it back and forth, it will cause the string at the other end to move back and forth and create something that sounds like vibrato. Now I'll play for you a little clip of that, and I'm sure you will wish that you could do something like this on the piano. I think that was pretty interesting, actually, to see the way the clavichord could do that vibrato idea. It's one of several things, when you think about it, that some of these older instruments can do that we cannot do on the modern piano. And actually, I just want to summarize those things. So, on the clavichord, you can play vibrato, something we can't do on the modern piano. On the harpsichord, one thing that you cannot do on the modern piano is you cannot do what we call coupling. In other words, that two strings can be played at the same time, so that using one finger, basically you are playing an octave. And you could also say one thing that the piano does not have is something like that lute stop, which creates such a unique sound that would be difficult or maybe even impossible to achieve on the piano. I think also worth mentioning, if you think about what these old instruments did that is different from what the piano does today and what it can do, is that in general, both the harpsichord and the clavichord, and indeed earlier pianos, had a much clearer sound. Sometimes that sound is really not the sound we want, that kind of almost staccato kind of sound that the music almost always has, whether you want it or not, on the harpsichord or on the clavichord. But one area where that can be an advantage is, for example, in the bass area of the piano. Oftentimes when we were playing on the piano in passages by Bach or Mozart, if they're in the low register, they tend to sound a little bit muddy. Whereas on the harpsichord or the clavichord, they did not. The sound was much clearer. That is partly because of the kind of, in the case of the harpsichord, the way that the strings are plucked. Of course, it has to sound clear. The clavichord had different kinds of hammers that had a much clearer sound than the hammers we use on a modern piano. And also the strings were much shorter, so they wouldn't resonate for as long. So those are some actual advantages of those older instruments over the modern piano. Now, as I said earlier, I would always want to hear Bach or Scarlatti on a modern piano rather than on a harpsichord or clavichord. Despite those minor disadvantages, of course, we can do much more with the piano than you could do with the harpsichord or clavichord. The range of color is 100 times greater. So, but it does bring up an interesting question, I think. Should we, when we are playing the music of, for example, Bach, should we be trying to imitate the sound of older instruments? And the truth is, I don't know the answer to that question. That's something that we should ask ourselves each time we are playing Bach or Scarlatti or other Baroque composers. Should we be trying to imitate in any way the sound of the harpsichord or clavichord or not? I think it's worth thinking about, but I don't have the answer to it. I think different performers do at times sound like they are trying to imitate older instruments. For example, Glenn Gould, when you hear him play Bach, sometimes he plays in a very, very dry way. I believe that part of that is because he thinks, I want to create that harpsichord kind of sound. On the other hand, Bach himself transcribed a lot of his own music for keyboard, and for example, he would take a violin concerto and transcribe it for harpsichord. Should we then be trying to imitate the harpsichord, or should we be trying to imitate the violin, or should we just make our own sound? I think it's a question we should always ask when we're playing that older music. I also want to make one other point, which I mentioned briefly earlier, but want to make sure this is clear to you. The harpsichord was generally the instrument of public performance, and the clavichord was more for music that you would play in your own home. And one thing we will talk about this semester is there are a number of pieces of music which we will listen to and which we will get to know, which might have been for public performance or might have been intended just for playing at home. And I think that's a sort of foreign idea to us now. We don't work on a Bach piece with the intention of never performing it in public. But I think there are a lot of pieces that he wrote that were intended really just to be played for yourself. And so that's something that we will discuss as the semester progresses further. So I hope this has been a useful introduction to you to what we're going to talk about this semester, the music from the Baroque era. As you do the required listening this week, you will be hearing some more harpsichord and clavichord. And I hope that that sound will be in your ear, that you'll have some idea of the possibilities of those instruments, and maybe therefore be inspired to search for some of those colors and ideas and ways of playing when you play Baroque music on the piano. And so I will see you soon. I will be there in person in just a little while. Okay, looking forward to seeing you all on September 23rd.